Everyone at the restaurant knew Robert, but no one really looked at him. He was just the waiter, the one who walked by with a tray balanced on his arm, took orders quickly, and smiled at the customers, even when he was tired. He heard it all. Complaints about cold food, people talking loudly on their cell phones, the chef yelling in the kitchen, and he always said, "I'm sorry, sir," or "I'm sorry, ma'am." Robert had worked at that restaurant for 7 years. He'd arrive before 7 in the morning to help wipe down the tables, arrange the cutlery, and make everything shine. He'd leave late at night, when the last customers had gone and the lights were dimmed. The place wasn't fancy. It was a mid-range restaurant, the kind that tries to seem refined, but where the kitchen staff was always fighting, and the owner complained that the books never balanced. But for Robert, that restaurant was his world. Even as just the waiter, he paid attention to everything. He watched every plate that came out of the kitchen. He noticed the smell, the color, the way the chef garnished the plate with little green leaves. And inside, he would think, if it were me, I'd do it differently. In truth, Robert's dream was never to be a waiter. Since he was a kid, he wanted to be a chef. Cooking was what made his heart beat faster. As a child, he'd spend hours in the kitchen watching his mother prepare lunch. He was fascinated by the smell of the spices, the bubbling pots. And his mother would say, "Robert, food isn't just to fill your stomach. Food has to embrace people's hearts." But life wasn't easy. When his father got sick, Robert had to start working early. He took a job as a waiter to help out at home. In the beginning, he told everyone it was just temporary, that he would soon study gastronomy. But the years passed, life got harder, and he was still there, waiting tables. And little by little, he stopped talking about his dream so he wouldn't sound foolish. At the restaurant, no one knew he loved to cook. When the kitchen staff yelled, Robert would just walk by silently, trying not to get in the way. The chef, Chef Silvio, was a gruff man, his apron covered in medals, who would scream even if the rice was 2 minutes late. Robert respected him, but he thought that sometimes the chef cared more about showing off than about making good food. Sometimes, at the end of his shift when everyone had gone home, Robert would sneak into the kitchen. He'd turn on just a small light, grab some leftover ingredients, and try to make dishes he had seen during the day. He'd copy the chef's way of cutting vegetables, mix spices. Once, he invented a sauce that was so good he almost cried with emotion, but he never told anyone. His colleagues thought he was weird. They said he worked too much, that he should find something else. But Robert was proud of his work. Even if he didn't earn much, he liked to see the customers leave happy. He liked finding quick solutions when something went wrong. Once, a customer spilled red wine on his white shirt, and Robert appeared with baking soda to clean it. He got a 5-star review online, but no one in the kitchen congratulated him. Deep down, Robert lived 2 lives. During his shift, he was the quiet, smiling waiter who solved problems. But at night, when the restaurant closed, he transformed into the invisible cook. He'd spend hours testing recipes, writing them down in a crumpled notebook. He wrote down everything he had learned, every new spice, every technique from the chef. And even when he was tired, he would go home dreaming of the day he could wear the white chef's coat and be called chef. But to him, that seemed as distant as the moon, because in his world, waiters didn't become chefs. At least, that's what everyone said, but life has its surprises, and everything started to change on a Saturday night, on a day when the restaurant was packed and a very important customer was about to arrive. Robert didn't know it, but that day was going to be the beginning of everything, the beginning of the story that would bring his name out of the shadows and onto the covers of magazines. And more than that, it would prove that even someone nobody sees can shine like a star. It was a Saturday night, and the restaurant was chaos. All the tables were occupied. The customers were talking loudly, glasses clinking, plates clattering. Chef Silvio was yelling non-stop in the kitchen. The heat from the stoves mixed with the smell of fried garlic, reducing wine and grilling meat. It felt like a battlefield. Robert ran from one side to the other, balancing plates, clearing dirty glasses, excusing himself past customers. Sweat was pouring down his forehead, but he kept a smile on his face. That's how he hid. Behind the smile, no one noticed how exhausted he was too. That day, the restaurant's owner, Mr. Orlando, was tense. A famous food critic had booked a table. It was the kind of visit that could turn the restaurant into a success or a laughingstock in the newspapers. Mr. Orlando kept repeating, "Nothing can go wrong tonight. Nothing." Inside, Chef Silvio was barking orders. "Where's the garnish for the fish? Is the sauce ready? Don't bring me any ugly plates." The cooks rushed around, clanging pans, stirring sauces, while the chef cursed at anyone who came near. Robert, though not part of the kitchen staff, tried to help. He'd run to get ingredients, grab extra napkins, deliver dishes, but always quietly so as not to draw attention. But that night, it seemed like everything was destined to go wrong. 20 minutes before the critic was due to arrive, the chef started coughing hard, a dry, heavy cough. He tried to keep cooking, but he turned red, clutching his chest. Mr. Orlando ran into the kitchen and asked what was happening. Chef Silvio could barely speak. He looked like he was about to faint. The staff stood around, not knowing what to do. Mr. Orlando said, "Call a doctor, take him to the hospital." 2 waiters helped the chef out. The restaurant was left without a leader. The sound of the customers talking seemed to get louder. Outside, no one knew what was happening, but inside, chaos was taking over. Mr. Orlando ran a hand through his hair, sweating. He shouted, "Now what? Who's going to cook? The critic arrives in 15 minutes." No one answered. The cooks stood there, frightened. They were good helpers, but they had never been in command. No one had the courage to take Chef Silvio's place. Robert was standing in a corner, holding a stack of dirty plates. He heard everything, his heart racing. He looked at the lit stoves, the simmering pots, and he thought, "I know how to do this, I know how to save this dinner." But he was afraid, very afraid, because in his mind, waiters didn't become chefs, waiters didn't give orders. But Mr. Orlando was desperate. He started shouting, "Someone has to make the dishes on the menu, we can't lose tonight." Robert took a deep breath. His hands felt cold, and on an impulse he said, "Mr. Orlando, I know how to make the dishes." The restaurant seemed to stop for a second. Everyone looked at him. Mr. Orlando's eyes widened. "You? But you're a waiter," Robert said. "I know, but I've watched Chef Silvio all these years. I know the recipes, I know the timings, I know the sauces." Mr. Orlando was shaking his head, nervous. "This is crazy. What if you mess up?" Robert replied, "If no one does anything, it will be worse. Let me try." The other cooks started to chime in. "Let him, Mr. Orlando. It's better than serving nothing." Mr. Orlando looked at Robert, took a deep breath and said, "All right, but don't embarrass me, for the love of God." And he ran out to attend to the customers in the front of the house. Robert took off his waiter's apron and tied on a clean white one he grabbed from a shelf. He washed his hands quickly. He stood there for 2 seconds looking at the pans as if he were about to jump off a cliff. Then he started giving orders to the cooks. "You dice the onions very fine. You prepare the broth. You plate the dishes." The staff looked startled, but they obeyed. They had never seen the waiter speak like that. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking. The critic was about to arrive. Outside, the chatter of conversation continued, with no one knowing that behind the kitchen door, the waiter was trying to save the entire restaurant. Robert stirred pots, tasted sauces, corrected seasonings, and incredibly, everything started to come together. In that moment, Robert felt his heart beating so hard, it felt like it would tear through his chest. But at the same time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He was in the place he had always dreamed of being, at the stove, in command. As the clock ticked on, Robert moved around the kitchen as if in a trance. The smell of browning garlic, the sound of wine bubbling in the pan, all of it made his heart race, but in a good way. It was as if he was finally in the right place, but at the same time, the fear wouldn't leave him. The assistants were tense, chopping vegetables, stirring broths, looking at him constantly, waiting for orders. Robert noticed their nervousness, so he spoke firmly, but without shouting. He'd say, "Easy, guys, it's going to work. Trust me." And little by little, the mood in the kitchen began to change. The guys who had never paid him any mind were starting to obey. At that moment, Mr. Orlando rushed into the kitchen, sweaty, his face red. He said, "The critic just arrived. He wants the house special." Robert felt his legs go weak. The house special was the filet in wine sauce with truffled potato puree, Chef Silvio's creation. A complicated dish full of steps, with each sauce having a precise consistency. Mr. Orlando stood there waiting for an answer, a desperate look on his face. Robert took a deep breath and said, "Leave it to me." And he began to gather the ingredients, speaking to his team. "Let's go, people. I need the meat trimmed, no fat. Is the broth ready? Where's the red wine?" As he started to prepare the dish, his mind was racing. He remembered Chef Silvio's gestures, the cooking times, every trick he had spied on while serving tables. It was as if all the knowledge he had kept hidden for years was finally coming out. He seared the fillets in the pan, butter bubbling, a delicious aroma rising. Meanwhile, he started on the sauce, reducing the wine with herbs. He talked to himself as he stirred. 2 minutes, or it gets bitter. Easy, don't let it stick. The assistants watched him with astonishment. No one had imagined the waiter knew all of this. Mr. Orlando stood near the door, peeking in. At one point, he asked, "Are you sure you know how to make this dish, Robert?" And Robert replied without even looking up, "I do, Mr. Orlando. Trust me." Outside, the dining room was full. The customers were talking loudly, laughing, toasting. No one knew that inside the kitchen, it was the waiter who was running everything. And the critic, a thin man in a dark suit with a severe expression, was waiting at the center table, fiddling with his napkin, impatient. When the sauce was ready, Robert tasted it with a spoon. The flavor was perfect. He almost cried with relief. He had one of the assistants plate the dish with a smooth puree, the sliced fillets on top, and the sauce drizzling slowly. He added some fresh herbs for color. Then he wiped the rim of the plate with a cloth, just like he'd seen Chef Silvio do. He handed the plate to the waiter who would serve the critic. He just said, "Take it easy and don't shake the plate." The waiter left, almost trembling. Mr. Orlando stood there, looking at Robert, speechless. He seemed torn between fear and hope. Out in the dining room, the plate was placed before the critic. The entire room fell into a strange silence. It seemed like even the other customers' silverware stopped clinking against their plates. Everyone watched as the critic speared a piece of meat, brought it to his mouth and chewed slowly. Inside the kitchen, Robert was motionless, holding a cloth, sweating. He looked through the crack in the door, trying to see the critic's reaction. The man chewed, looked at the plate, took another bite, and suddenly he gave a slight positive nod. The room erupted in murmurs of relief. Mr. Orlando rushed into the kitchen, grabbed Robert's shoulder and said, "He liked it, Robert. The critic liked it." Robert let out the breath he had been holding. His face was shining with sweat and tears. The assistants started to clap, some laughing, others still in a bit of shock. Mr. Orlando said, "You saved the restaurant tonight." Robert shook his head, still in disbelief, and he thought to himself, maybe I am more than just a waiter. But just then, in the dining room, the critic called the waiter back and said, "I want to speak to the person who cooked this dish." And there, in that moment, Robert's destiny began to change forever. When the waiter returned to the kitchen saying the critic wanted to speak with the chef, Mr. Orlando went pale. He looked at Robert, then at the other assistants, not knowing what to say. The staff stood still, holding pans, slowly stirring sauces, as if they didn't know whether to keep working or pay attention to the bomb that had just been dropped. Mr. Orlando shook his head and said, "Robert, are you sure you want to go out there and talk to him?" Robert stood there, breathing deeply. His heart was beating so hard it hurt his chest. He replied, "I am, Mr. Orlando. I'm not going to let you lie and say it was Chef Silvio who made it." The restaurant owner sighed deeply. He looked tired. He ran a hand over his face and said, "Then go, my boy. Go on out there and speak well." Robert took off the dirty apron, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and straightened his wrinkled white shirt. He took a quick look in the pantry mirror just to make sure he didn't have sauce on his face. Then he walked out of the kitchen slowly, feeling his legs so light he thought he might fall. In the dining room, the sound of cutlery started to rise again. People were commenting softly, craning their necks to see who would come out of the kitchen. When Robert appeared, the room seemed to stop. Even the critic, sitting at the middle table, raised an eyebrow in surprise. The waiter who had delivered the dish pointed at him and said, "It was him, sir. It was Robert who made it." The critic was silent, looking Robert up and down. He seemed to be taking in every detail, the wrinkled shirt, the calloused hands, the frightened look. Then he said, his voice firm, but not shouting, "You're not the chef here, are you?" Robert shook his head slowly. He said, "No, sir. I'm a waiter, but I know how to cook. And tonight, I had to take Chef Silvio's place." The critic just stared at him, his expression unchanged. The entire room held its breath. It felt like even the chandeliers had stopped swaying. Then the critic said, "You know your dish was excellent, don't you?" Robert looked embarrassed, scratched the back of his neck, and replied quietly, "I did the best I could, sir." The critic placed his fork on the table, crossed his arms, and said, "Well, you should have confidence, because that was the best filet in wine sauce I've had all year." A murmur ran through the room. Some people started to clap. Mr. Orlando stood there, his hand on his chest, as if he had just averted a heart attack. The critic continued, "Tell me something, Robert. Where did you get that flavor in the sauce? There's something there, a different note. It's not just wine. There's a sweet, bitter spice I couldn't identify." Robert blushed, fidgeted with his hands, and said, It's a spice my mother used to use, a touch of cinnamon and a pinch of pure cocoa. It gives the sauce depth. I always thought it tasted good." The critic clapped his hands once, firmly, and said, "Brilliant. You should be in a kitchen, not serving table." Robert didn't know where to look. The entire room was staring at him, some people smiling, others still looking like they didn't understand anything. The critic stood up from the table, took a card from his jacket pocket, and handed it to Robert. He said, "If you ever decide to work in a serious restaurant, look me up." And he left, leaving the bill paid and a huge tip on the table. The room exploded with chatter. People taking pictures, waiters whispering, customers commenting. Robert stood in the middle of the room, holding the card, not knowing what to do. Mr. Orlando came over, gave him a light pat on the shoulder and said, "You saved my skin tonight, kid. And now, I think the whole city is going to know who you are." In the following days, the story of the waiter who saved the restaurant spread quickly. A food blog published the news. Then, a small article appeared in a local paper. People started coming to the restaurant just to ask if it was true. Some customers demanded to be served by the waiter chef. Robert tried to go on with his normal life, but everything was changing. His colleagues in the kitchen started to look at him differently, some with admiration, others with envy. But for Robert, it was still hard to believe. He'd spend his nights looking at the critic's card, not knowing if he had the courage to take the next step. But destiny wasn't going to give him much time to think, because that night wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The days passed, but Robert was still in a bit of a daze. Every time he arrived at the restaurant, someone would come up and ask, "You're the one who made that dish, right?" Some spoke with admiration, others with curiosity, a few with poorly disguised envy. He would just smile and say, "It was just luck, nothing special." But inside, he'd get a knot in his stomach just remembering the critic praising his sauce in front of everyone. Mr. Orlando, the restaurant owner, couldn't stop talking about it for days. He'd repeat to anyone who would listen, "My restaurant was saved by the waiter." And he'd tell the story to every new customer. He even said he was thinking of putting Robert's name on the menu, creating a special dish called the waiter's filet. But it wasn't all applause. The atmosphere in the kitchen changed. The assistants started looking at Robert differently. Some respected him more. Others, like Junior, who was Chef Silvio's right-hand man, would grumble in the corners. Junior would say loudly, "A waiter is a waiter, not a chef. Cooking for one night doesn't make anyone a cook." Robert pretended not to hear, but every one of those sentences cut like a knife, because deep down, he was also afraid he was stepping into a place where he didn't belong. He didn't have a culinary degree, he hadn't taken any expensive courses, he hadn't worked in a fancy restaurant. Everything he knew, he had learned on his own, by watching. Even so, he couldn't get the card the critic had given him out of his head. Every day he'd come home, open his wallet, look at the card, and read the printed name, Victor Bernard, food critic. He'd imagine what it would be like to call him, but fear always won out. What if it was all an illusion? What if it was just a passing compliment? Meanwhile, the restaurant started to get busier and busier. People would come from distant neighborhoods just to try the famous waiter who had saved the dinner. Some wanted to take a picture. Others ordered the special dish, and Mr. Orlando didn't waste any time. He put the filet and wine sauce on the menu with a little sign, "A creation of our talented Robert." One Saturday night, the restaurant was packed. Mr. Orlando called Robert aside and said, "You need to get in the kitchen tonight. The people want your dish. No one makes it like you do." Robert froze. He said, "But Mr. Orlando, I'm a waiter." The owner retorted, "And since when does that stop someone from cooking? Get in there, kid. It's your chance." Robert took a deep breath, tied on an apron, and went into the kitchen. The assistants fell silent when he entered. Junior, his arms crossed, said, "So you want to be in charge of everything now?" Robert replied calmly, "No, Junior, I just want to cook. Whoever wants to help is with me. Whoever doesn't can leave." The kitchen grew tense, but little by little, some of the assistants started to come over to him. One said, "What should I chop, Robert?" Another asked, "How many minutes should I let the sauce reduce?" And Robert started to give orders, but without shouting. He spoke softly, but firmly. And slowly the kitchen started to function again. As he worked the pans, Robert remembered his mother. He remembered her saying, "Food is an embrace, son." And he would stir the sauce slowly, taste it, close his eyes. And when it was right, he would smile, because he felt he was doing something right. That night, more than 20 plates of the filet and wine sauce left the kitchen, all of them perfect. The dining room was full of praising customers, people applauding. Mr. Orlando was beside himself with joy. At the end of the shift, he called Robert into his office and said, "You're not just a waiter, my boy. You're a chef. If you want it, the position is yours." Robert stood there, not knowing what to say. His heart felt like it was in his throat. He thought about everything he had been through, the years carrying a tray, the days hidden in the kitchen testing spices. And now he was hearing this. But before he could answer, Junior burst into the office, slamming the door, and he said, "This is absurd. This guy doesn't have a diploma. He's going to ruin the restaurant's reputation." The mood grew heavy. Mr. Orlando looked at Junior and said, "Get out of here, Junior. The one who saved my restaurant was Robert." But Robert held up a hand and said, "Easy. I don't want to fight. I just want to cook." Mr. Orlando sighed and said, "Then decide, Robert. Do you want to keep waiting tables, or do you want to be a chef?" And in that moment, Robert's life was about to change forever. Robert stood in the middle of the office, feeling his heart hammer against his chest. Mr. Orlando was waiting for an answer. Junior, standing in a corner, was looking at him with a defiant expression. Robert took a deep breath, looked down, and said, "Mr. Orlando, I want to continue as a waiter. I'm not a chef." The restaurant owner seemed disappointed. He ran a hand through his hair, shook his head, and said, "Are you sure, kid? Because you have talent, and the restaurant needs you." Robert was quiet. He thought of the critic, of the card tucked away in his wallet, of the compliments he had received. But deep down, he felt afraid. Afraid he wasn't ready, afraid of failing. Junior smirked, as if he had won the argument. He said under his breath, "That's right. Everyone in their place." Mr. Orlando turned to him annoyed. "Shut up, Junior. You should be ashamed of yourself for talking like that." But the mood was already too heavy. Robert left the office in a daze. He went back to the dining room, put on his waiter's apron, and started clearing plates. But this time, everything felt different. Customers were calling him by name, asking if he was going to cook again, and Robert would just smile, not knowing what to say. That night he got home and told everything to Roger, the friend he shared the apartment with. Roger listened silently, then said, "Robert, let me tell you something. You're afraid because people have always told you that you're just a waiter, but you've already proven you're much more than that. And if you don't take this chance now, you'll spend your life carrying a tray and wondering what could have been." Robert looked at his friend, his eyes full of tears. He said, "But I don't have a diploma. I can't talk all fancy like chefs do. I haven't taken courses in France or any of that." Roger laughed and replied, "A diploma doesn't teach you passion, my friend, and you cook with passion." Even so, Robert went to sleep without making a decision. He tossed and turned in bed, staring at the ceiling. The critic's words kept coming back to him. "You should be in a kitchen, not serving tables." The next day, he arrived at the company to a strange atmosphere. Mr. Orlando called him aside and said the local newspaper had called, wanting to do a story on the waiter who saved the restaurant. Robert went pale. He said, "But I don't know how to do an interview, Mr. Orlando." The owner replied, "Then it's time to learn." Shortly after, two journalists arrived with a camera. They started filming the dining room, asked to see the kitchen, and they especially wanted to film Robert cooking the famous filet in wine sauce. Junior was furious. He kept muttering, "This is a joke. It's going to ruin the house's reputation." Robert was trembling from head to toe, but he decided to try. He put on the white apron, washed his hands, tied back his hair. When they turned on the camera, his hand was shaking so much he almost dropped the spoon, but little by little he calmed down. He explained the ingredients, showed how he seared the meat, talked about his mother's trick with the cocoa and cinnamon. The journalist asked, "Robert, you've always been a waiter. How did you learn all this?" And he replied, his voice still shy, "By watching and by testing things out when everyone else went home." The journalist smiled and said, "That's pure talent." At the end of the shoot, Mr. Orlando came into the kitchen and said loudly, "Robert, I won't accept you saying you're not a chef, because a chef isn't just a diploma. It's knowing how to save the day when everything is falling apart. And you did that." Robert lowered his head, emotional, but he still couldn't call himself a chef. It seemed too big for him. At the end of that shift, Junior passed by him and said quietly, "You're going to fall flat on your face. This isn't for just anyone." Robert didn't answer, but for the first time he felt anger, not at Junior, but at himself for still having so many doubts. That night he came home, opened his wallet, and took out the critic's card. He stared at the phone number printed on it. He picked up his cell phone, typed half the number, but then deleted it. He could feel his heart racing. He wondered whether to call or not, whether to take the risk or not. And as he held the card in his hand, he thought, maybe it's time to stop being afraid. The next day, Robert woke up different. He had deep, dark circles under his eyes, had barely slept, but he felt a strange courage inside him. As he made coffee, he stared at the critic's card on the table. He picked up his cell phone again, stared at the screen. His finger would get close to the call button, but he'd stop. He arrived at the restaurant early. As soon as he walked in, he noticed the tense atmosphere. Junior was at the stove, scowling, and didn't even look in his direction. Some assistants were whispering, as if talking about Robert behind his back. Mr. Orlando, on the other hand, seemed cheerful. He called Robert to a corner and said, "Son, I saw the recording yesterday. You were born for this, and I'm not just saying that as your boss. I'm saying it as a man who loves food." Robert smiled, but there was still a fear deep inside, tightening his chest. He said, "Mr. Orlando, Junior won't accept it, and I don't know if I can handle this pressure either." The owner replied, "Son, there will always be bitter people, but the ones who make a difference are the ones who have the courage to try." That day, the dining room was busy. Many customers began to order the famous filet in wine sauce. Mr. Orlando came into the kitchen and announced, "Robert is making the dish today." Junior almost dropped his spoon on the floor. He said, "This is absurd." But Mr. Orlando said firmly, "If you're not satisfied, Junior, there's the door." Robert felt his heart race. He grabbed an apron, tied it around his waist, and began to work. He spoke to the assistants in the same calm but firm way. "I need the meat trimmed. Don't let the sauce reduce too much. Bring the cocoa." The staff obeyed. Even those who didn't like him could see that Robert knew what he was doing. As he worked the pans, Robert remembered his mother's words. "Cooking is putting feeling into the dish, son." He could smell the wine mixed with cinnamon and cocoa. He would close his eyes and imagine his mother smiling, holding out a spoon for him to taste. In the middle of the rush, one of the waiters came to the kitchen and said, "Robert, there's a man who wants to talk to you out here." Robert wiped his hands on his apron and went out to the dining room. When he got there, he almost fell over. It was the food critic, Victor Bernard, sitting alone at a table. He was wearing a dark suit, round glasses, a serious expression. The critic looked at him and said, "I had to taste your dish again, but mainly I needed to talk to you." Robert froze. He replied, almost stammering, "You'd like the filet, sir?" The critic nodded. "Yes, but sit down here first." Robert sat, not knowing where to put his hands. Victor said, "You know, Robert, I get thousands of good dishes a week, but few of them move me. And your dish moved me, because it had truth." Robert stared at the table, not knowing what to say. The critic continued, "I want to help you. I have a friend, the owner of a renowned restaurant, who is looking for a new chef. I think you should try." Robert almost fell out of his chair. He said, "But I never studied gastronomy. I don't have a diploma, I don't have anything." The critic smiled. "That doesn't mean anything when you have talent, and you have talent to spare." The dining room was quiet. Several tables were looking at them, curious. The critic lowered his voice and said, "The problem is, if you stay here, they'll keep treating you like a waiter, because people get used to seeing you in the same place. But you deserve more." Robert felt his heart pounding so loud he thought everyone could hear it. He looked at the critic and said, "But I'm afraid. What if I can't handle it?" The critic replied, "Every chef has been afraid. The difference is, who cooks even while they're shaking?" Victor then placed a new card on the table. He said, "Here is the phone number of the restaurant owner. Call him. Tell him I sent you." And he stood up. Before leaving, he turned to Robert and said, "You have a gift, kid. Don't waste it." When the critic left, the dining room started whispering. Robert stood there holding the card, not knowing whether to smile or cry, because at that moment he realized he had the biggest opportunity of his life in his hands. But he was also terrified of losing everything. And deep down, he knew that if he didn't try now, he might never have the courage again. Robert stood there in the dining room holding the critic's card as the murmur of the tables grew around him. Some people were whispering, pointing, some even smiling. It seemed like everyone knew he had just been given a life-changing chance, but at the same time it felt like the floor had disappeared from under his feet. He went back to the kitchen in a daze. Mr. Orlando ran over to ask what the critic wanted. Robert just shook his head and said, "He wants me to go work at a big restaurant. Says I have talent." Mr. Orlando was quiet for a second. Then he smiled. He said, "I'd be sad to lose you, but if you don't try, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Junior, who was listening to everything, snorted loudly. "Oh, great. Now the waiter thinks he's a star." Robert looked at him, took a deep breath and replied, "I don't think anything, Junior. But if someone believes in me, I have to at least try." Junior rolled his eyes and went back to chopping onions forcefully. In the following days, Robert lived in a whirlwind. He'd come home, put the critic's card on the table, stare at the phone, but he didn't have the courage to call. Roger, his roommate, would say every day, "Call Robert. The worst that can happen is it doesn't work out." But Robert kept thinking about the huge pans, the fancy kitchen, the pressure of being a real chef, and the fear would paralyze him. At the restaurant, his fame only grew. People would come from distant neighborhoods just to eat the filet and wine sauce. Mr. Orlando was making money like never before, and he was always telling Robert, "The house is yours. If you ever want to stay, the head chef position is yours." But Robert felt torn. He liked it there, the place, the people, Mr. Orlando, who had been like a father to him. But at the same time, something inside him was screaming that he needed to try for something bigger. One day, after his shift, Robert was sitting in the back of the dining room, alone, his head down. Roger showed up there, sat next to him and said, "Robert, let me tell you something. Do you know how many times I've failed in life trying new things? Dozens. But none of them hurt as much as wondering what would have happened if I had tried. Don't be that guy, my friend." Robert was quiet. Roger continued, "You're scared, I know. But if there's anyone who deserves this chance, it's you. Because you spent years swallowing your pride, working in silence, dreaming in secret. Now is your time." That night, Robert came home, took the card out of his pocket and placed it on the kitchen table. He picked up his cell phone, stared at the screen. He thought about everything he had been through, the customers who had treated him poorly, the days hidden in the kitchen testing sauces, the nights going home with barely enough money for the bus. And finally, he dialed the number. On the other end of the line, a male voice answered, firm but polite. "Hello?" Robert swallowed hard and said, "Good evening. My name is Robert. Mr. Victor Bernard gave me your contact. He said you might be looking for a chef." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then the voice replied, "The waiter who became a chef. I've been expecting your call. Can you come in tomorrow to talk?" Robert almost dropped the phone. He replied, "Yes, I can, sir." And he hung up, trembling. Roger was on the sofa watching television, and when he saw his friend hang up the phone, he jumped up. "You called, man? You really called?" Robert just nodded, smiling, with tears in his eyes. Roger gave him a hug so tight it almost knocked them both over. That night, Robert went to sleep with his heart racing, but for the first time in a long time without fear. He was terrified, yes, but he also felt a flame lit inside him, because he knew that, whatever happened, at least he was trying. And as he closed his eyes, he thought, tomorrow could be the day my life changes forever. The next morning, Robert woke up before sunrise. He lay in bed for a few seconds, looking at the ceiling, feeling his heart beat so hard it seemed to echo off the walls. He got up slowly, washed his face, and put on the best shirt he had. Simple, but well-ironed. He took the critic's card, checked the address of the restaurant where he had the interview. Roger woke up too, and seeing his friend tense, said, "It's going to be fine, Robert. Just go in there and show them who you are." Robert tried to smile, but his stomach was aching with anxiety. He left the house early, took the crowded bus, and stood the whole way, holding on tight to the rail, his face turned to the window. He watched the streets fly by, thinking about what he was going to say. He was afraid that when he got there, someone would laugh at him, afraid of making a fool of himself. But he also felt something new, a will to fight for his dream. When he arrived in front of the restaurant the critic had mentioned, Robert stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, watching the movement. It was a beautiful place. Modern facade, full of glass, plants by the door. Elegant people were coming and going. It seemed like another world. Robert took a deep breath and went inside. At the reception, a friendly woman asked, "Can I help you, sir?" Robert replied, his voice barely audible, "I have an appointment with Mr. Guillaume at 9. She smiled and said, Victor Bernard called about you. Please wait just a moment." A few minutes later, Guillaume appeared, a tall, thin man with grey hair, dressed in an impeccable white chef's coat. He had a serious face, but his eyes were calm. He extended his hand to Robert and said, "You're Robert, a pleasure. I'm Guillaume, the executive chef here." Robert shook his hand, sweating. Guillaume led him to an immense kitchen, all gleaming stainless steel. Several cooks were working in silence, focused. Delicious smells hung in the air. The chef said, "Victor spoke very highly of you, but I need to see you cook. Are you willing?" Robert swallowed hard and said, "Yes, sir." Guillaume smiled but remained serious. "I want you to make a signature dish, whatever you want, something that represents you." Robert stood there for a few seconds, looking at the counter full of ingredients. Fear almost paralyzed him. But deep down, something was pulsing inside him. So he took a deep breath and said, "I'll make my filet in wine sauce, but I'll put my own touch on it." He started to work. He separated the ingredients, trimmed the meat, melted butter. As he stirred the sauce, he explained everything to Guillaume. "I use cinnamon and cocoa in the wine. My mother taught me. It gives the flavor depth." The chef watched everything in silence, his arms crossed. Other cooks started to stop and watch Robert cook. He didn't shout, he wasn't nervous, he just spoke softly, focused, stirring the pan as if he were caressing it. The smell of the sauce spread through the kitchen. Guillaume took a spoon, tasted it, raised his eyebrows. He just said, "Interesting." Robert was tense, but he continued. He plated the dish carefully, wiped the rims, placed fresh herbs. He handed the plate to the chef. Guillaume tasted a piece, chewing slowly. Then he said, "Simple, but it has soul, and that can't be taught anywhere." Robert didn't know what to say. Guillaume looked at him and said, "Robert, a diploma teaches you technique, but someone who cooks with passion makes dishes no one forgets. Victor was right about you. You're hired." Robert blinked several times, as if he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. He asked, "Are you serious, sir?" The chef smiled and replied, "Absolutely serious. You'll start as a sous chef, but if you keep this up, you'll go far." At that moment, Robert felt a lump in his throat. He remembered his mother, Mr. Orlando, the restaurant where he had worked for so many years. He thought about everything he had swallowed in silence. And for the first time, he felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He left the restaurant with the sun shining brightly. He called Roger, almost shouting, "I got hired, man! I'm a chef now!" On the other end, Roger was shouting too, "I knew it, Robert, I knew it!" But deep down, Robert knew the journey was just beginning, because although he had taken the first step, there was still a long way to go. But at that instant, he knew he would never again be just the invisible waiter. In the following days, Robert's life became a whirlwind. He started at the new restaurant as a sous chef, learning everything from scratch, but at the same time, teaching too. Because right away, Guillaume realized that Robert had something no one else there had, a natural intuition for cooking. On his first service as a sous chef, he was nervous. He was afraid of making a mistake, of someone asking him something technical he didn't know the answer to. But when he got his hands on the ingredients, everything became easier. The colleagues began to notice that Robert had a light touch, a sharp palate, and most importantly, passion. Guillaume, the executive chef, would sometimes stand beside him just to observe. One day he said, "You don't seem like a rookie, Robert. You seem like you were born in here." Robert laughed a little shyly. He still found it hard to believe that he was now wearing a white coat with his name embroidered on the chest. Sous Chef Robert. But it wasn't easy either. There were nights when he left exhausted, thinking he couldn't handle it. Once, he messed up the consistency of a sauce, got reprimanded, felt upset. But he came back the next day, determined not to repeat the mistake, because now he knew he deserved to be there. Meanwhile, the fame of the waiter who became a chef continued to grow. Stories came out in blogs, local newspapers, even a TV channel showed up at the new restaurant to interview him. They asked about his story, about the wine sauce dish, about the cinnamon and cocoa. One day, in the middle of a service, an envelope arrived in the kitchen. It was from Mr. Orlando. Inside was a handwritten letter. It said, "Robert, my boy, I miss seeing you here, but I am very proud. You deserve the world. And here at the restaurant, everyone still talks about you." Robert read the letter with tears in his eyes. He thought of Mr. Orlando, of the noisy dining room, of the nights he spent balancing a tray. That night, after the shift, Guillaume called Robert over to sit on a high stool near the counter. Only the low hum of the freezers was audible. Guillaume said, You have a future, Robert. If you want, in 6 months you can take over a station of your own, and who knows, in a year, become the head chef. Robert looked at him wide-eyed. He asked, "Do you really think I can?" Guillaume replied, "I don't think. I'm sure. You have something that can't be taught. You cook with soul, and that's what turns a cook into a star chef." Robert didn't know what to say. He smiled, held back his emotion, and just said, "Thank you, chef." When he left the restaurant that night, the sky was clear, full of stars. He walked to the bus stop with his chef's coat still on. People on the street looked at him as if he was someone important, and for the first time, he felt like he belonged in this world. He got home and found Roger awake, waiting to hear the news. He told him everything, talked about Chef Guillaume's plan, about the possibility of being the head chef. Roger listened with a huge smile and said, "Man, do you realize what you've done? You were the guy they wouldn't let out of the shadows, and now you're the guy everyone wants to listen to. You proved that talent doesn't depend on a diploma. It depends on having the courage to show who we are." Robert sat on the sofa, still in a bit of disbelief. He took Victor Bernard's critic card in his hand, looked at it, and smiled. He thought, if it weren't for that day, I'd still be waiting tables today, without ever knowing what I'm capable of. The next day, Robert went back to the new restaurant, full of energy. When he entered the kitchen, his colleagues greeted him, some even calling him Chef Robert. He still wasn't used to it, but he felt an enormous pride. Because at that moment, he was no longer the invisible waiter who walked quietly in the corners. He was the guy who had been seen, and more than that, the guy who had proven to himself what he was capable of. As he stirred a pot, he smiled to himself, and he thought of his mother saying, "Food is an embrace, son." And he knew that there, in the kitchen, he was finally embracing the world. And that's how Robert, the waiter no one noticed, became a star chef. And he discovered that sometimes the only thing that separates us from our biggest dream is having the courage to take the first step. All right, it's that time. If this story has you hooked, let's do the full ritual. Hit the like button to support the channel, subscribe so you don't miss a beat, and ring that bell to be the first to know what's coming. Your opinion is golden, so drop it in the comments below.